Everyone hit the floor when the gun came out. Sarah didn't. That was the first mistake she made, and the one that changed everything. Outside, the rain was doing what rain does to New York in March, not falling so much as insisting. The diner was half empty the way a diner is half empty at that hour. The hour between the breakfast rush and the lunch crowd, when the city briefly forgets to need anything. Booth by the window, a construction worker with mud still on his boots. Counter stool near the register, an older woman in a church hat nursing a decaf. 2 teenagers near the back sharing earbuds and a plate of onion rings they were both pretending not to eat. Sarah was behind the counter refilling the syrup dispensers when the door opened and Bright walked in. She knew before she saw the mask. She knew by the way he carried the cold air in with him, by the particular rhythm of his footsteps on the tile. 7 years of learning the sound of danger had rewired something in her nervous system, not into fear, but into a terrible, quiet recognition. She kept her hands moving anyway, kept her face empty. That was the other thing 7 years had taught her. He pulled the gun when he reached the counter. The construction worker went down sideways out of his booth. The teenagers scrambled. The woman in the church hat clutched her purse to her chest and made a sound like a small, private prayer. Someone's coffee mug shattered on the floor. The whole room collapsed into itself in under 3 seconds, bodies folding, breath vanishing, the ordinary world snapping shut like a book. Sarah set both palms flat on the surface. She looked at the gun the way you look at something you have already survived once before. Not brave, not reckless, just done being surprised by it. A long, slow exhale through her nose, and then her voice, even, unhurried, almost gentle, like she was offering him a way out he hadn't earned. You don't want to do this here. Not a plea, not a performance, a statement of fact extended to him like a hand he didn't deserve. The diner held its breath. Bright's grip tightened on the gun. Above the mask his eyes moved, fast, uncertain, recalibrating, the eyes of a man who had rehearsed this scene and suddenly found himself in the wrong one. He had expected screaming. He had expected dropping. He had not expected her. Nobody ever did. In the corner booth, a man in a charcoal suit placed his coffee cup back into its saucer without a sound. He had not moved when the door swung open, had not flinched at the gun or reached for the phone in his jacket pocket or shifted his weight toward the exit the way a careful man would. He simply sat, perfectly still, in the particular stillness of someone who has learned how to be the most dangerous thing in any room without ever announcing it. His name was Seong Gi, and danger was not what had stopped him. It was her voice. 7 years is long enough to convince yourself you've forgotten something, long enough to file it under grief and circumstance and the version of yourself that no longer exists. He had done all of that. He had been thorough about it. He had rebuilt himself from the wreckage of that night with the kind of cold precision that left no room for loose ends, no sentiment, no debt, no ghosts. He had been wrong about all of it. Because he had heard that voice once before, on a bridge in the rain, when he had nothing left and she had given him the only thing that mattered. 4 words, spoken without pity in the same steady register she was using right now on a man with a gun. His jaw tightened once. He set down his coffee. He did not look away. Somewhere behind the counter, Sarah was still standing, palms flat, spine straight, eyes level, and the room around her was still holding its breath, and the gun was still there, and she was still the only person in the diner who wasn't afraid. For now, he would let her handle it. She always had. The video was 12 seconds long. Someone had filmed it on a phone from under a table. Shaky, half obscured by a chair leg, the audio thin and compressed. You could see the gun, you could see the bodies on the floor, and you could see Sarah, both palms flat on the counter, completely still, saying something to the gunman that the microphone almost didn't catch. By the time the police finished their report, it had 40,000 views. By the time Sarah got home, changed out of her uniform, and sat down on the edge of her bed with a glass of water she kept forgetting to drink, it had 400,000. She didn't sleep. Pete called at 7 the next morning. He didn't apologize, which she had expected, and he didn't yell, which surprised her. He just used the word situation 4 times in 90 seconds and said he couldn't have that kind of attention on a cash-only establishment. Said it the way men like Pete say things they already decided, like he was reading from a card he'd written the night before. "I'm going to need you to not come in." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "My check?" she said. "I'll leave it at the counter." She hung up before he could say anything else, sat with the phone in her lap and looked at the water stain on the wall across from her bed, the one shaped like nothing in particular. She had looked at it every morning for 2 years. It had never looked back. She was not going to cry about Pete's Diner. She wasn't. The video kept moving. It crossed into morning show territory by noon, anchors using words like fearless and ice cold over the shaky footage, freeze-framing on her face, on her hands, on the stillness of her while everything else in the frame was chaos. They didn't know her name yet. They called her the Waitress. They called her a viral sensation. They called her the woman who didn't flinch, which was the one that stuck, the one that got clipped and shared and stitched into other videos until her 12 seconds were everywhere, attached to music she hadn't chosen and captions she hadn't written. She turned her phone face down and did not turn it back over. 2 men watched the video that day, in 2 different parts of the city, for 2 entirely different reasons. One of them watched it 6 times in a row on a laptop in a sparse, expensive apartment, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his expression unreadable, except for something around his eyes, something careful and old, and very quietly undone. The other watched it once. Then he smiled and started looking for her. He found her in 4 days. It wasn't difficult. It never was when he decided something needed to be done. He had people who were good at finding things, quiet, efficient people who asked no questions and filed no paperwork, and Sarah had not been hiding. She was simply a woman who had lost her job and was now spending her mornings at the public library on Flatbush, updating a resume on one of the shared computers, applying to positions that would pay her under the table the way Pete's had. She didn't look up when he sat down across from her. "That seat's taken," she said, without turning from the screen. "By who?" She looked up then. He was not what she expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected. The suit was charcoal, expensive without announcing itself, and he sat with the particular stillness she remembered distantly from the diner without yet knowing why. His face gave nothing away. His hands, folded on the table, were relaxed. She looked at him the way she looked at most things, steadily, until she understood them. "You were in the corner booth," she said. "Yes." "You want an interview for something? A talk show, a podcast?" "No." Sarah turned back to the screen. "Then I'm not interested." He didn't move, didn't shift or clear his throat or do any of the things people do when they're being dismissed and don't know how to hold it. He just waited, with the patience of someone who had learned that silence was its own kind of leverage. "I own a restaurant," he said finally. "Jan. Front of house manager position. The hours are reasonable, the salary isn't." He placed a card on the table beside her keyboard, face up, and slid it 1 inch in her direction. "It's yours if you want it." Sarah didn't look at the card. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough." "You watched a 12-second video." "I watched you stand still when everyone else fell down." He paused. "That's not something you learn. That's something that gets built into you, slowly and at a cost." His voice didn't change, but something underneath it did, a slight shift in weight, like a door opening just enough to show the dark behind it. "I recognize the cost." The librarian hummed around them. A child laughed somewhere in the stacks. A printer churned. Sarah looked at the card. "Jan, Park Avenue South." A phone number in clean serif font. Nothing else. She thought about the water stain on her wall, about Pete's voice reading from his card, about her resume on the screen, which was honest and sparse and would not be enough. She picked up the card. She didn't say yes, but she put it in her pocket, and Seong Gi stood and buttoned his jacket and left without asking for anything else. That, more than anything, was why she called. 7 years earlier, Sarah was 22 and walking home in the rain because the last train had gone and she had $3.40 in her pocket and the cab fare was $4. She found him on the Williamsburg Bridge, not standing on the railing, not dramatic in the way the movies made it. He was just leaning over it, forearms on the barrier, looking down at the water with the specific stillness of someone who had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the courage to honor it. His jacket was soaked through. He wasn't shaking, which was the thing that scared her most. People shook when they were uncertain. He was not uncertain. She stopped walking. She didn't call out to him, didn't announce herself or reach for her phone, or do any of the things she would have said before that night that she would do. She just stood in the rain 6 feet away and looked at the side of his face and thought about what she knew about men who had gone quiet in that particular way. She put her elbows on the railing beside him. He turned his head slightly, registering her presence without speaking. Up close, he was young, younger than she'd thought from a distance, with the kind of exhaustion in his face that had nothing to do with sleep. His eyes moved to her once, then back to the water. They stood like that for a long time. The rain didn't let up. A cab crossed the bridge behind them. The river below was black and indifferent. "I have nowhere to be," Sarah said eventually. Not to him exactly, just into the air between them. He didn't answer. "So I'm just gonna stand here for a while." She kept her eyes on the water. "You can do whatever you want. I'm gonna be here." Another long silence. "You don't know me," he said. His voice was rough from disuse or something worse. "No," she agreed. "Then why?" It wasn't quite a question. She considered it anyway, the way she considered most things, honestly, without decoration. She said, "Because it's raining, and morning takes a long time to get here, and it's easier to wait with someone than without." He looked at her then, really looked, like he was trying to find the angle, the performance, the thing she wanted from him. He found nothing, because there was nothing to find. He didn't move from the railing for another hour. She didn't leave. When the sky finally began to lighten at the edges, pale and unconvinced, he pushed himself upright and stood with his hands in his wet pockets and looked at her with an expression she couldn't name. She never learned his name that night, never asked. She had no idea he had spent 7 years learning hers. Jan was nothing like Pete's diner. Pete's had laminate countertops and a coffee machine that rattled, and a specials board where someone had misspelled omelet for 3 years running. Jan had clean lines and low light, and the kind of quiet that expensive restaurants cultivate deliberately, the way you cultivate silence in a church, not the absence of sound, but the presence of intention. The staff moved like they had been choreographed. The menu changed with the season. The tablecloths were pressed without a single crease. Sarah learned it in 2 weeks. Not just the mechanics of it, the reservation system, the supplier schedules, the particular preferences of the regulars who came every Thursday and needed their table by the window without being asked. She learned the rhythm of it, the way the dinner service had its own internal weather, building pressure through the 7 o'clock rush and breaking clean by 9. She learned which of the kitchen staff needed space before a Saturday and which ones needed to be talked down after. She learned the room the way she had always learned rooms, by watching, quietly, until she understood what it needed. The staff noticed. They fed so, carefully, the way people compliment someone they're slightly unsure of. Seong Gi noticed too. She could feel it without looking, the way his attention would settle on her briefly during service, a passing evaluation that found nothing to correct and moved on. He was not the kind of man who praised easily or often, but he stopped inserting himself into the front of house within her first 10 days, which she understood from him was the same thing. She kept the wall up anyway. It wasn't unfriendly. She was professional in the way a well-made door is professional, functional, presentable, offering exactly what was required and no more. She answered his questions directly. She brought problems to him cleanly, with solutions already attached. She did not linger in his office or accept the offer of a drink after the last table cleared, or let conversations extend past the point of necessity. He didn't push. That was the thing about him she was still adjusting to. He occupied space without expanding into it, never reaching past whatever boundary she established, as though he had mapped her edges in that first library meeting and committed them to memory. It should have made her comfortable. It made her careful instead, because she knew what it meant when a man learned your boundaries that precisely. It either meant he respected them, or it meant he was patient. And in her experience, patience in a man was not always the virtue people dressed it up to be. So she excelled. She kept her distance. She went home to her new apartment, smaller than she wanted, quieter than she was used to, and sat with her tea and told herself this was enough. Most nights, she almost believed it. It started with the tea. Not intentionally, Sarah had developed the habit of making a cup after the last table cleared, something to do with her hands while the staff finished closing, a small, private ritual that marked the end of one thing before she began the walk home. She used the kitchen's good oolong, brewed it longer than the packet suggested, and drank it standing at the pass because sitting felt too much like staying. One Thursday, she made 2 cups without thinking. She stood there looking at them for a moment, then picked both up and walked to Seong Gi's office and set one on the corner of his desk without a word. He glanced up from whatever he was reviewing, looked at the cup, looked at her. She had already turned to leave. "Thank you," he said. She lifted one hand slightly, acknowledgement without ceremony, and went back to the pass to drink her own. The following Thursday, he was already in the kitchen when she arrived at the counter. He said nothing, made 2 cups, placed one beside her, and took his back to the office. That was how it began, not with conversation, with the simple, repeated fact of being considered. The conversations came later, and sideways, the way real ones always do, not announced but arrived at, through the side door of some other subject. A question about a supplier that became an exchange about the neighborhood, a comment about a difficult table that became something longer and less professional, both of them leaning against the pass in the empty restaurant with their cups, the low light doing what low light does to the edges of things. She learned that he was methodical about small pleasures, a specific brand of ceramic, a particular walk he took on Sunday mornings, the way he reread books rather than collecting new ones. He learned that she was funny, in the dry, offhand way of people who have survived things, the joke always arriving a beat late and landing harder for it. He laughed once, genuinely, without reservation, at something she said about a customer's wine order, and she felt the sound of it land somewhere unexpected and held very still in the aftermath, the way you hold still when a bird lands close and you don't want to scare it off. She didn't examine that feeling. She set it down and stepped away from it like it was someone else's belonging. But the cups kept appearing. 2. Always 2. Without discussion or acknowledgement or anything that could be named and therefore complicated. Just the quiet fact of it, that she had been thought of before she arrived, that the water had already been boiled, that someone had counted her in before she'd counted herself. It was such a small thing. She was terrified of how much it mattered. She came home on a Tuesday to find him sitting on her front steps. Not threatening. That was the first thing she registered, and the registration itself was the trap, because Bright had never needed to be threatening. That was the thing people on the outside never understood about men like him. They imagined violence in the obvious ways, imagined raised voices and broken things, and missed entirely the quieter architecture of it, the way a man could make you small without ever lifting a hand, the way he could walk back into your life looking perfectly reasonable and leave you feeling like a child who had borrowed something without asking. He stood when he saw her, smiled the smile she had once loved. "You look good, Sarah." She stopped at the bottom of the steps. Her keys were in her hand. She did not move toward the door. "How did you find me?" "You're not hard to find." He said it gently, which was worse than if he'd said it as a threat. "I just wanted to check on you, after the video, after everything." He tilted his head slightly. "You didn't call." "I wasn't going to call." "I know." Another smile. Patient, familiar. "I'm not here to make trouble. I was worried." She knew this script. She had spoken every line of it at some point, from both sides. She knew that worried meant watching. She knew that "I'm not here to make trouble" was the opening move of someone who intended exactly that, delivered so reasonably that any resistance on her part would look like the problem. She knew all of it. She let him in anyway. She couldn't explain it afterward, and she tried, replayed it in the shower the next morning, standing under water that had gone cold without her noticing, trying to locate the exact moment she had stopped being the woman in the diner and become the woman who used to check his expression before she spoke. It hadn't been a decision, that was the honest answer. It had been a subsidence. The way old ground gives way not all at once, but gradually, silently, following the path it had always followed, because the path was still there. He stayed 2 hours. He was kind the entire time. He talked about nothing dangerous, mutual friends, a neighborhood they'd both known, small, ordinary things, and she answered in the careful, measured way she had spent years perfecting and had almost forgotten she knew. When he left, he touched her shoulder briefly at the door. Just his hand, just a moment. She stood in her hallway for a long time after. The apartment that had felt like hers that morning felt differently shaped now, smaller, the ceilings lower, the walls a half step closer than they had been before he arrived. She didn't make tea that night. She didn't think she deserved it. She was late for the first time in 3 months. Not by much, 11 minutes, but Seong Gi was already in the front of house when she arrived, reviewing something at the host stand, and the look he gave her when she walked in was not accusatory. It was the other thing, the careful, measured thing. The look that meant he had noticed something was wrong and was deciding how to approach it. She hung up her coat and got to work. He let her alone through the lunch service, which she was grateful for. She moved through the room on autopilot, doing everything correctly, smiling at the right moments, refilling water glasses a beat before they needed it. The performance was flawless. It always was when she was running from something. She had learned early that competence was the best place to hide. He found her in the back corridor after the last table cleared. "Are you all right?" 3 words, quiet, no preamble. Something in her chest pulled tight. "I'm fine." "Sarah." "I said I'm fine." She turned to face him, and the tightness cracked open without warning, the way things crack when they've been held too long under too much pressure. "Don't do that. Don't say my name like that." He went still. "Like what?" "Like you know something, like you're waiting for me to—" She stopped, pressed her fingers against her forehead. "I'm not a problem you found. I'm not something you pulled off a bridge and now you get to—" The words came out wrong, too fast, cutting in directions she hadn't intended. "You gave me a job because you felt guilty, because you've been carrying some debt for 7 years and I was convenient, and I took it because I needed it, and that's fine, but don't stand there looking at me like I'm something you're responsible for. I am not your project." The corridor was very quiet. Seong Gi had not moved. His expression had not shifted into defensiveness or hurt or the cold withdrawal she had braced for. He just stood there and absorbed it, the way he absorbed most things, completely, without deflecting. "You're right," he said. She blinked. "The job was a debt. You're right about that." His voice was even, but not empty. "That was why I found you. It wasn't why I kept looking." He paused, choosing words with the care of a man who had learned that careless ones cost too much. "Those are different things, Sarah. I know you know the difference." The fluorescent hum of the corridor filled the silence between them. She did know. That was the problem. She knew the difference and she was terrified of it, and Bright had been in her apartment 4 days ago, and her ceilings were still too low. She grabbed her coat. "Good night," she said. She didn't look at his face on the way out. She couldn't afford to. He was waiting outside the elementary school where she had picked up a weekend tutoring shift, the kind of cash-in-hand work she kept in her back pocket for emergencies, a habit left over from leaner years. It was 3:15.
Parents were collecting children at the gate, the ordinary machinery of an ordinary afternoon. Bright stood across the street with his hands in his pockets, watching. She saw him before he saw her notice him, which gave her 2 seconds to make a decision. She felt the familiar subsidence begin, the old ground shifting, the ceilings already starting to lower, and she let herself feel it, all the way through, the way you let a wave pass through you instead of bracing against it. Then she crossed the street. He smiled when she approached, opened his mouth to set the scene, to arrange the furniture of the conversation the way he always did, establishing the terms before she'd found her footing. She didn't give him the opening. "I know what you're doing," she said, quietly, evenly. Not the careful, measured quiet she'd used in his presence for years, but the other kind, the kind from the diner, the kind from the bridge, the kind that lived underneath everything else and had always been hers. "I know how you do it, I know what it costs, and I'm telling you clearly so there is no confusion, you don't get to come back." Bright's smile didn't drop, it recalibrated. "Sarah, you're just here, you're just checking on me, you're just worried." She held his gaze without flinching. "You've been justing for 3 years, and I've been making myself smaller to fit inside your just. I'm done." Something shifted in his eyes. The smile thinned. "You think that man is going to save you," he said, and his voice had changed now, the kindness stripped back to reveal the architecture underneath. "You think working in his restaurant makes you something different. You're still the girl from—" "I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm not asking for anything from you. I'm not explaining myself or defending myself or negotiating." She took 1 step closer, close enough that he couldn't arrange her into the background of his story. "I'm telling you once, standing still, so you hear it properly. Don't come to my home, don't come to my job, don't wait outside buildings where I am. We're done, and that's not a discussion." The afternoon moved around them, children, parents, the ordinary world. Bright stood very still. Then he laughed, short and cold, and turned and walked away without another word, the way men like him always left when the performance stopped working, not with drama but with contempt, as though it had been your fault all along for making them bother. Sarah watched him go. Her hands were steady. She hadn't flinched. She waited 4 days before she called him. Not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted to be sure the decision belonged entirely to her, that it came from the same steady place she had stood in outside the school, and not from relief or loneliness or the residue of something she was still clearing out. She had spent enough of her life moving toward people for the wrong reasons. This one she wanted to get right. On the 5th morning, she picked up the phone. He answered on the 2nd ring, which told her nothing, because he always answered quickly, efficient and unhurried at once. She had stopped trying to read anything into it. "There's a diner on Court Street," she said. "Nothing fancy. The coffee is good. Sunday at 9, if you want." A pause. Small and clean. "I'll be there," he said. She hung up before it could become anything more than that and sat for a moment with the phone in her lap and the morning light coming through her window at the angle it came through on Fridays when she had nowhere to be until noon. The apartment felt the right size. The ceilings were where they were supposed to be. She arrived first and chose a table in the middle of the room. Not a corner booth, not a seat with her back to the wall and her eye on the exit, which had been her default arrangement in every public space for longer than she cared to count. Just a table in the middle because the light was good there and she wanted to sit in good light. Seong Gi arrived at 9 exactly. He saw her before she raised her hand, crossed the room without hurrying, and sat down across from her. He was in a dark jacket, no tie, which she had rarely seen. He looked like a person instead of a position, and she found she preferred it. The server came, they ordered coffee. Neither of them reached for a menu. "I owe you an apology," Sarah said. "You don't." "I said things that were unfair." "You said things that were true." He looked at her directly, the way he always did, without agenda. "And some things that were true once and aren't anymore." I know the difference. The coffee arrived. She wrapped both hands around the mug. I'm not good at this. At letting people... She paused, finding the honest word. Stay. I know. I'm telling you that up front, so you have the full picture. I've had the full picture for a while, Sarah. The corner of his mouth shifted, barely. I'm still here. She looked at him across the small table, in the good light, in the diner she had chosen, at the hour she had named. No debt between them, no performance, no architecture of someone else's making pressing the walls inward. Just 2 cups of coffee. Just this. Okay, she said quietly. And finally, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let someone stay.
And that's where we leave them. Not with a grand declaration or a perfect ending tied in a bow, but with 2 cups of coffee, a table in good light, and a woman who finally stopped making herself smaller to fit inside someone else's story. Sarah didn't need saving. She never did. She needed space to remember what she'd always known, that the voice that talked a gunman into hesitating, that stood on a bridge in the rain for a stranger, that said, "You don't want to do this here," without a single tremor, that voice was always hers. It just took her a while to stop letting other people speak over it. And Seong Gi, he waited 7 years for 4 words spoken on a bridge to find their way back to him. Some debts aren't about money or obligation or power. Some are quieter than that. The kind you carry not because you owe someone your life, but because they showed you it was worth keeping. That's the kind of story this is. If this one landed for you, if you found yourself holding your breath at the diner, or standing on that bridge in the rain, or sitting across that table in the good light, then you already know what this channel is about. Stories that don't rush, characters that earn it, emotional payoffs that hit harder because the writing made you wait for them. There is so much more where this came from. So if you haven't already, subscribe. Hit the bell so you don't miss what comes next, because the next story is already in progress, and if you liked this one, you are going to want to be here from the first line. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to read about a woman who didn't flinch. Those people are everywhere. They deserve to see themselves on the page. Thank you for reading all the way to the last cup of coffee. I'll see you in the next one.